One whopping indicator has come our way in the form of this: the resignation letter of one John Healey, the Defence Secretary, on a crucial day. This couldn't be worse for the already embattled Prime Minister.
This is, as they used to say in Fleet Street, a marmalade dropper. It's extraordinary that he's finally been brought to this extreme of resignation.
Let's move on to Iran, the Strait of Hormuz.
Maybe Trump can live with this, just sort of burbling on. I mean, certainly that's a better alternative for him than a deal which looks like abject humiliation and worse than the Obama nuclear deal.
Hello and welcome to the Fourcast Indicators. I'm Matt Frei.
And I'm Mark Urban, and this is the podcast where we look at the signals that analysts watch most closely, separating the wheat from the chaff and finding the telltale signs that suggest imminent and significant change.
Well, we were going to talk about Iran today, and we will continue to talk about Iran and whether the ceasefire is holding, what the US is up to in a bit. But first, one whopping indicator has come our way in the form of this: the resignation letter of one John Healey, the Defence Secretary, on a crucial day. This couldn't be worse in terms of timing, both for defence spending, but also for the already embattled Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer. Mark, how important is this? And give us some extracts.
Yeah, I mean, this is, as they used to say in Fleet Street, a marmalade dropper, I think. A pretty extraordinary moment for the government. Time and again, I've heard over the last year or two, since Labour came to power, why don't the service chiefs resign? Things like that from people in the military, because they felt they were being squeezed for money, that the government wasn't prepared to match its big talk about going to a war footing with the cash.
All hat and no cattle, as they say in Texas.
Well, absolutely. And now, lo and behold, not the service chiefs, the Defence Secretary has gone, and he's exposed, I think, some rather damaging detail. Firstly, that he was only told a couple of days ago on Monday what the financial settlement was for this defence investment plan. Remarkable, really. We've been waiting a year for this to be resolved, and he was only told 4 days ago. And then he says the settlement has been backloaded. Now, what he means by that is that the Treasury is only giving the increases as slowly as it possibly can. And John Healey specifies in his letter that that will only get defence to 2.68% of economic output, GDP, by 2030.
That's
in other words,
below the 3% that had been promised.
Well below, and moving much more slowly than they want. Everyone and people who were involved in the Strategic Defence Review last year said to me last year, it's vitally important that this be front-loaded. In other words, start spending the money now, bake it into the calculations. And what it speaks to is the rearguard action fought by the Treasury, obviously in a climate of really tight public spending, of troubled borrowing, of all of those things, to be fair to them. But the suspicion that people have in the MOD and some in Downing Street throughout this is that the reason that the Treasury has tried to slow walk this at every turn is the hope that maybe post-Trump, maybe there's a deal in Ukraine, maybe this, maybe that, maybe we don't have to spend that much. And that's, of course, why the MOD is so keen to get the money soon.
I mean, a couple of political points here. First of all, John Healey was considered, softly spoken but steely-willed as he is, as one of the stalwart loyalists to Keir Starmer.
Yes.
That's gone. Secondly, the point that he makes, there's some really damning detail, as you just outlined in the letter, but also the general point he makes is that you talk a big game, boss, but you don't act on it. You don't enforce your political will where you said it should be rhetorically. All that stuff about, we live in, this war in Ukraine goes beyond the borders of Ukraine. This is something that affects us all. We need to be ready on a war footing, et cetera, and then there's no cash. But also, as you might remember, when Jess Phillips resigned not so long ago as Minister for Safeguarding, she made more or less the same point. You talk a big game on your objectives, but there's no follow-up. There's no political or financial commitment to make any of that happen. So this is a really big blow to Keir Starmer. Just, a few days, a week before the by-election in Makerfield, Andy Burnham, who's been increasingly questioned about his financial commitments, hasn't said much on defence yet. I wonder whether he'll be pledging as many billions to defence as he's pledged on just about everything else.
Well, quite. And I think just to get an insight as to how personally difficult for John Healey this gap between what's said and what's done has been. I can think of a couple of moments. So at the London Defence Conference, which happens every year in spring, where I'm one of the moderators, Keir Starmer said in 2025, he made this fundamental statement that reviving the defence of the country was one of the core purposes of the Labour government and made it absolutely central to the government's agenda. This year, Keir Starmer wasn't there. John Healey was on stage and he was asked, so, are we now ready? Are we on a war footing? And he said yes. And there were audible groans from the audience. The audience of specialists in this area found it patently incredible. And I think in recent months, he's heard so much of that from the military, from the manufacturers who want a clear steer. Is it worth investing in new factories and all the rest of it? All of that stuff with all the knock-on effect on jobs and the ability of the UK military to meet its NATO commitments, all of those things he knew were failing. And I think it's extraordinary that he's finally been brought to this extreme of resignation in order to dramatise that.
And also, at the beginning of the Ukraine war, which now seems a very long time ago, because it is a long time ago. I think today's a day when it's lasted longer than the First World War.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is a significant milestone and a rather depressing one. At the beginning of that war, with Boris Johnson going out there and those initial shoulder-launched missiles that we gave the Ukrainians, there was a sense both at Westminster and in the media and in the pub that Britain was, we might have screwed up on a number of things, but on defense, we're right there. We're on the side of the right, on the side of Ukraine, and we're doing our bit and we're helping them to fend off the Russians, which was all true. And by the look of those Germans, they aren't spending enough. And look at all these other people, they're all too lily-livered. That narrative is gone, completely gone.
It's been reversed because this week, the survey of what NATO members are doing to meet these increased spending targets that they agreed last year in The Hague put Britain at number 31 out of 32 members.
Which is shocking.
The only one not doing as well as Britain was Iceland, which has no armed forces.
Yes, right, exactly. They've got a fair excuse.
So that is another moment, maybe tipping point moment.
And also
for John
remember,
Healey.
And also remember the other thing when Starmer went to see Trump the first time after the inauguration. He was one of the first people to arrive. I think it was February. And he slashed the UK's aid budget, overseas aid budget, exponentially in order to make room for an increase in the defense budget in order to curry favor with the new man in the White House, Donald Trump. Trump acknowledged this. He said, thank you for doing what we've all just done, thanks to Elon Musk and Doge, which is to slash aid. And thank you for increasing your defense commitment, by X percentage points. And we appreciate that. And it was essentially done to curry favor, with the White House. And it worked for about a day. And now it looks terrible.
Coming back, maybe before we press on to Iran and all the other issues, that point about the uplift that they got, I think indicates the cynicism with which the Treasury and the Downing Street were treating this whole thing. Because, as you say, a big slice of the money, and this was just for the first 2 years, the year we're in and next year, a big slice of that money was basically just raiding the overseas aid and development budget. And when John Healey had to stand up in the Commons to announce the defence review, he said the first $6 billion is going to come from savings inside the MOD. So cutting $6 billion, bringing in, I think it was $7 billion from the overseas aid budget. So the major part of that so-called uplift was not new money at all.
Yeah.
And that's been the kind of fight he's had from the get-go, and which, of course, he's now decided he's had enough of.
This will have quite serious repercussions for Keir Starmer. It's yet more bad news. Let's wait and see what happens. If he's listening to indicators, which I'm sure he is, this is one hell of an indicator. And I don't think there's an easy way out of this at all. Anyway, let's move on to Iran, the Strait of Hormuz.
So we had this moment with Donald Trump yesterday, Wednesday, where he, in one of his classic kind of photo spray, free associating moments, couldn't stop himself from saying, oh, you'll never guess how much oil we've been sneaking out of the Strait of Hormuz. And he talked about 100 million barrels of oil in recent weeks. Now, of course, there might be a temptation to dismiss this as Trump being Trump and exaggerating and all the rest of it. But
Turns out it's true.
Well, there are some very interesting indicators that
Yes.
suggest that there has been something going on. We, I think, alluded to it the week before last on this podcast, that maybe some ships were getting through. And all the way through this, the last few weeks, we've been looking at numbers. Now, of course, in normal times, between 100 and 120 ships a day go through the Strait of Hormuz. The numbers people are talking about are 15.
Yeah.
But consider that most of the time when the full-scale shooting was on, it was 2 or 3 a day. So something is happening, and all sorts of other indicators. I've seen from people analysing satellite photography that oil storage in Kuwait seems to have gone down a bit, suggesting they've been loading up
stuff out,
loading up some tankers. That tankers are loading fuel onto smaller ships in various places. So things are happening, and I think it's a fascinating question. How much this actually explains a lot of what we've seen in recent weeks, the sort of jostling, the military jostling. Is this Iran trying to shut down this leakage and America trying to stop them doing it, or indeed get even more ships out? I think it is. And that explains the shoot down of that helicopter.
Which is apparently involved in the operation to safeguard this secret shipping route, which of course is no longer secret because Trump has told the world about it.
Yes,
as
absolutely.
He does.
Yes.
But the EFT did a brilliant sort of analysis of how this thing works, and I got slightly nerdy about it. So some of the details which are interesting. So there are 3 shipping lanes, aren't there, in the Strait of Hormuz? There's the northern one, which is in Iranian territorial waters, which they would love the world to use because they can just charge them at the toll gate.
Yeah, they're telling everyone to use that.
Exactly, telling them to use it. Then there's the middle one, which used to be used. That's now apparently been mined by the Iranians. That's not being used at the moment for obvious reasons. And then there's the one that hugs the coast of Oman. Now, I didn't realize this, but like everyone else, I'm learning a lot of geography in this war. The coastline of Oman is incredibly rocky and difficult to navigate. And the shipping lane that they're talking about is at some stages no wider than 800 meters. And by the way, ships are going in both directions in the middle of the night with their GPSs turned off, or whatever that can be tracked by the location systems, and under American air cover, yes. So this is a very perilous route that not every tanker captain will be happy to, or their bosses will be happy to engage in. But I guess you're right. If 15 ships get through every day, and by the way, some of that traffic is in both directions, that's quite significant. I mean, it's not super significant, but it's slightly more than 10% of the pre-war total, daily total. That would account for a certain lack of urgency about opening the Strait of Hormuz. And then, of course, meanwhile, the Americans have been busy enforcing their blockade, including the shooting, the attacking of this Palau-flagged oil tanker that was going from Oman to a port in Iran, in which 3 Indian sailors lost their lives.
Yeah.
The deputy chief of mission in Delhi has been called in to see foreign minister in Delhi, I think today. So the Indians are very upset by this, understandably. But it kind of illustrates what the risks are,
And the real nature of this struggle, where the US tries to stop Iran exporting, but assist everyone else. And obviously Iran is trying to stop this. To what extent it might even explain the degree to which Hezbollah in Lebanon has been acting in a rather punchier way than many people expected. Also drone strikes on places like Kuwait. Lots of measures taken by Iran that make you wonder, well, gosh, do they really want to deal, or is this ceasefire finally going to collapse? But I think a clue now as to their frustration, perhaps, that the blockade is being eased. And of course, the other thing that's going on...
Sorry to interrupt, who's more frustrated by this blockade? Do you think Iran is or the United States?
Well, of course, classic Trump, he tries to make out that he holds all the cards. And of course, we have to see this revelation about sneaking ships out in that context. But I think it might help explain, along with the oil price, which he also referred to yesterday, we're very happy with it where it is sort of thing, might explain why he's not been in more of a rush. We dare I say it, we all thought, the chances of a TACO were pretty high that he would declare victory and just try and shut the thing down as quickly as possible. And he has defied expectations in that regard.
I just wonder whether he's actually okay with the kind of permanent sense of unease.
Well, you've said that from the start.
I don't think, and I also don't think he really cares about the midterm elections very much. I think he is quite happy with the Democrats winning the House of Representatives, which they are more likely to do, a lot more likely than winning the Senate, although that's also possible. If they win the Senate, that's a real problem for him, because it might kickstart, some meaningful proceedings against him and his people. If they just get the House, and they're stupid enough to launch another impeachment proceeding, that plays right into his hands, because he loves to attack the Democrats. He loves to be a victim of their, of whatever they're trying on politically. So I wouldn't be surprised if actually he genuinely doesn't care that much about the affordability crisis and how that will play at the ballot box in November. And then the other thing, I guess, is that if the straits are, closed but not totally closed, if the ceasefire keeps getting broken, and if he can carry on claiming that he's really close to a deal, which he's done, CNN have counted the claims. He's done it on
38.
38 occasions. 38 occasions, that's quite something. Then it keeps him in the headlines. And the biggest fear that Trump has always had is that people ignore him, that they lose interest, that he no longer occupies our attentional economy. And I guess he's doing everything to keep us kind of glued to the telly or whatever you're glued to, his social media feed. But it's totally counterproductive. And I've never known any leader, or indeed any leader's Secretary of War, as Pete Hegseth now has to be called officially, thanks to Congress, where there is so much guff and bombast and so contradictory that it is inevitably measured against the reality of the situation. And it always makes the bombast look ridiculous.
Yeah. Look, I think a lot of things sort of make more sense, don't they? I mean, and your point, absolutely valid, and you have been saying since the get-go that maybe Trump can live with this, just sort of burbling on. I mean, certainly that's a better alternative for him than a deal which looks like abject humiliation and worse than the Obama nuclear deal, and giving the Iranians tons of money for just reopening the Strait of Hormuz, which is the core of their negotiating position. Unfreeze 24 billion in assets and we'll reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Well, maybe Trump thinks he can just slowly ease that blockade. And of course, before all this started, 20 million barrels a day. We know roughly half of that are now going by alternative routes. In other words, the pipe across Saudi Arabia, the pipe across the UAE. If this opens up another 1 or 2 million barrels a day, you start to get into 60-odd% of where you were before all this started. It all makes it more manageable going forward, as you say, towards the midterms.
I want to talk about drones to you.
Yes.
And you know much more about drones than I do. You can drone on drones as long as you like. So tell us about, so there's some interesting stuff on drones. What is it?
Well, let's just wind back a few seconds to our parting thoughts about Trump and his motivations. I mean, he doesn't want a bad deal, but he also doesn't want dead American service members. So a fascinating thing which has opened up in the last few days is signs or indicators of just how the Americans are using technology and uncrewed systems to do this securing of the Strait of Hormuz. Now, this goes from the Reapers, which we know back from Afghan times, keeping surveillance over the Strait of Hormuz, and they've lost a few of those doing it, but hey, better that than a plane with people in it. They've lost over 30, I think, since this Iran war started. It also goes to uncrewed surface ships. Now, when that Apache helicopter was shot down, badly damaged and ditched into the water, the two aircrew in there, the two army soldiers flying it,
who survived,
were in the drink. And a thing called a Corsair, an uncrewed vehicle, which is sort of the size of the kind of pleasure cruiser you might see in the marina, but with no sailors on it, which apparently had been plying the waters of the Strait of Hormuz, was diverted to go and pick them up. The army soldiers climbed onto the back of this uncrewed boat. It then took them to somewhere safer, where a rescue helicopter with people on it came and picked them up.
That's amazing.
So I think we're getting these insights into, if indeed, and we sort of think it's true, the Americans are helping more ships through, how they're doing it without taking undue risk with their people. So the real question is, what are the effects if more oil is getting through if the economy is adjusting to this.
Indeed. Well, let's put this to Yael Selfin, a fellow at the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. She's also chief economist at KPMG. Welcome to the program, Yael. I mean, we've all been predicting this oil shock, and yet oil prices seem to be stubbornly benign below $100, even though the ceasefire is being broken left, right, and center. What's going on there?
Well, it would be markets' expectations that the conflict will end faster. I think if that changes, we will see oil prices going further, much higher than where they are now. So this is definitely an upside risk.
Right. So the markets are being a bit too optimistic, do you think?
Well, I think they're potentially a little bit too optimistic, but also if you look at it from a rational perspective, you would have expected that conflict to end more quickly.
There's a question of supply and demand, though, isn't there? It's Mark Urban here, Yael. Is more oil getting out than we think? And are some big buyers like China using less than we may have assumed? Is this all part of the way the price is being moderated?
So one of the things that we have at the moment is that the global economy is relatively weaker than, say, where we were in 2022. So demand is lower, but also we've got some of the economies, for example, China, where they had quite a large reserve, if you like, so the pressure wasn't as strong. And there are alternative energy sources as well that countries are now using much more than before. There's also this expectation of a very large supply of gas from the US coming on stream later on. So overall, the markets are less concerned about the dependency on oil price, on oil, if you like, at this stage, because the demand is weaker, but also there's alternative sources of energies.
But I wonder how long that can continue, because, I mean, we think we know that the Chinese are importing something like 40% less, oil from the Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz. They've been apparently shutting down some of their refineries under the guise of maintenance, but essentially they're just churning out less stuff. And of course, they've got these stockpiles that they've been building up over time. But at some stage, they're going to run out of the stockpiles, aren't they? They're going to whittle them right down. Do we have any idea when that moment might come, and what are the consequences of that?
I don't. But I'd say they're using coal as well. So it's not just oil. There's other things they're using. Their usage and technology to use green energy and especially wind and solar energy has improved quite significantly as well. So you need to factor that in as well. And overall, I think they're probably more resilient than what you would have been anticipating.
Aha. Well, on that theme, one of the topics which was obviously of interest to journalists was whether people's summer holidays would all go by the board because of a shortage of jet fuel. And I know that some analysts like Javier Blas was pretty sanguine about that from the get-go. Do you think we'll get through this summer without disruption to flying?
Are you asking for a friend, Mark, by the way?
Asking for the neighborhood.
This is a really good question, Mark, actually, because this is something we were worried about a few weeks ago, especially actually on the impact of some of the European economies that are heavily dependent on tourism in the summer season. For example, Greece, Spain, and Italy, where a significant reduction in tourism during the busy season would mean a sure recession in those economies. So there's a potential big impact. But so far, we haven't actually seen it. And we have seen evidence of jet fuel, for example, coming from places like Nigeria and Africa more broadly. So it doesn't seem to be the case so far.
What about some other products in the oil production, gas production process, or side products like sulfur, for instance? I read that the price of sulfur has increased more than the price of any other commodity as a result of the strait being closed. That has an impact on the production of some metals. It obviously has an impact on fertilizer. Are you more worried about sulfur than you are about oil and gas?
I am worried about food prices connected to that fertilizer things that you mentioned. And that is because not only it is disproportionately impacting the poorer consumers, but also because it has a broader, longer term implication, because even if the crisis, say, finishes today, the cost of fertilizers that were purchased already are going to feed into inflation up to 2027. Yeah, so it is a more permanent, the duration will be longer. So for us, that is one of the main concerns.
Yael Selfin, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I still want to know, especially with the World Cup approaching, and I'm sure what Trump would want to know as well, whether this thing will just accompany, the world's greatest sports event, as we're all trying to focus on a bit of footy, or is there a light at the end of this tunnel? I mean, part of me thinks this could just go on and on and on, which would be utterly depressing and ultimately really bad news for our economies. Or there could be some resolution, because behind closed doors, we are told, I'm told, I'm sure you're told, the wheels of diplomacy are churning away quite nicely. But with what result?
It's a very complex knot to untangle, isn't it? The situation now in the Middle East. And of course, you've got the element too of Israel acting in Lebanon against Hezbollah. Obviously, there are reasons why they want to keep acting, but Hezbollah is also still firing rockets and drones into northern Israel, and thus keeping the pot boiling. Now, here's an indicator. Over the past 36 hours, quite a big mobilization of reservists in Israel. Some people speculating, oh, Lord, there's going to be another operation in Gaza. Others speculating that this is designed to influence Hezbollah, to say we are prepared to go into Lebanon in much greater strength unless you knock this off. We don't know. But that's a potential cloud on the horizon in what otherwise, I think, has, in certainly for this episode of Indicators, been a moderately positive outlook, hasn't it? Because yes, the thing being unsolved leaves all sorts of hostages to fortune, including in Lebanon, things that could engulf the region in conflict again. But the damage to the international economy may be being lessened, and it's conceivable that the American military have found an answer to the blockade at some level of the Strait of Hormuz.
Perhaps I'm not quite as optimistic. I mean, it's only a bat squeak of optimism, but I think even that might be snuffed out by the kind of known unknown of what the Israelis are up to. I mean, it's so fascinating, this particular conflict. You have three parties in this conflict. You started off with two parties acting together, the US and Israel, and then Iran on the other side. Now you have three parties not acting in concert with each other. So you obviously Iran versus US, but increasingly US versus Israel. I mean, the fact that Trump had to throw his toys out of the pram not once but twice this week, using very salty language to Netanyahu and about Netanyahu, is interesting. He has understood that his interests in ending this war diverge with Israel's interests. The Israeli public believe this is unfinished business, whether you're talking about Lebanon or whether you're talking about Iran. And Netanyahu is caught between a rock called unfinished business in both those theaters and a hard place called Donald Trump saying, call it quits. And I think he's, on a daily basis having to decide, who does he have to listen to more? The electorate that, actually wants this war to be completed, that will decide his fate later this year in the Israeli election. And if he doesn't win, he could end up quite easily in jail. There's the ongoing corruption trial. That could be very bad news for him. Or does he listen to Donald Trump and stay on his good side and call it quits? I mean, it's a very hard choice for him to make.
Absolutely.
And the only thing that helps him a little bit is that Trump has not yet, as far as we know, put down a red line. You carry on messing up my deal with Iran, if there, as much as there is a deal. If you do that for your own interests, be they political or strategic, I will not give you Patriot missiles. I will, cut the defense spending. And again, there's a fourth front in this war, and that is, of course, on the domestic front in the United States. I'm not even talking about gas prices and inflation. I'm talking about an increasing number of Republicans who are siding with Democrats to stop, Trump being able to conduct this war without Congress giving it an official go-ahead. That has happened in this last week. That's a big blow to Trump, who likes to do things without Congress. On the Democratic side, when it was suggested by some of the potential contenders for the Democratic nomination that they should, stop funding Israel's, defense mechanism, stop giving it lots of defense freebies, as they have done forever. Even Rahm Emanuel, the former mayor of Chicago, Barack Obama's chief of staff, former ambassador to Japan, even he weighed in and said, we have to stop funding Israel's wars. It shows you that in America, the domestic political scene has shifted.
So going back to the possible clouds on the horizon, you've got Netanyahu pressing on. And I think he's facing a lot of criticism in Israeli domestic politics for embarking on this war at the end of February in the first place, because the way things ended last year, we'd had exploding pagers, we'd had a brief and apparently successful war against Iran. Things were looking pretty good from an Israeli security point of view. He chose war one too many times. Does he make the same mistake again in an attempt to double down before the Israeli election? But I've got to say, now you haven't been speaking about the agency of the Iranians in this as well. I think the danger there as well, the other storm cloud, is they miscalculate. That with signs that their grip on the strait might be being challenged a bit more successfully, and everything going on in Lebanon, that they choose not to settle, and that they believe they can carry on.
Because they're drunk on their newfound power, arguably, right? So they were pummeled. The supreme leader was killed on day one. The other supreme leader, his son, the Nepo Ayatollah, hasn't been seen in public. I mean, this is pretty bad news. But they're so, you just look at the posters in Iran, look at the rhetoric coming out of the regime, and look at the way that we've responded, right? So you talk to people, younger people. They think, Iran is giving America a bloody nose. I mean, even in this country, this is, the Iranian regime that we're talking about that kills people like that in the streets without even a shadow of a doubt. I mean, they're brutal. And yet, here they are surviving. The danger is, as you said, that they're suffering their own form of hubris.
They overcook it, yep.
I think that's it. We've cooked
week.
this edition of Indicators quite nicely with a bit of news to kick off on. Let's leave it there. Mark Urban.
Mount Frei.
That's it. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.